You haven't started.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the Beit Midrash. Look how lovely it looks in here. Good to see everybody. Good to welcome everybody and good to learn with y'all today. Thank you for joining. We're at a big parsha this week, a event-filled parsha with Parshat Yitro. And before we had started on, there were some people who there was, I thought, a comment that they weren't thrilled with it, but let's open it up for Rabbi Jonathan Sacks's commentary on Parshat Yitro in his volume Judaism's Life Changing. So thoughts, comments, reactions, and we'll start with and jump in from there. They'll all jump in at once.
Okay. Well, I hope so. I know we're studying this book, but we mentioned that the Ten Commandments are spelled out in this parsha of the week, right? So then there's this one, I've been a stranger in a foreign land. So that's sort of, you hear it so much in discussions about Jewish people and what we do and what's important to us. So my question is, how important is that? I mean, should it have been an 11th commandment? Why are there only 10? And does this one fit in importance?
So, well, which page are you on, by the way?
Yeah, that's
Mishpatim, not Yitro.
That's really next week, I think.
See, that's what happens when we try to read two.
What I'll say kind of loosely to the question is there's 10 here which are kind of given a little bit higher value because they seem, though the Midrashim tend to argue about whether this was the case, but it seems, at least from the literal reading of the Torah, that these are the 10 that everybody heard, and then God speaks more personally to Moses about the other 603 of them. But there is something kind of universal about these and critical to Jewish thought about these 10, whereas us being strangers in a strange land is historically accurate, but not necessarily, I think, what God had, we'll say, intended for us to do. It seems to be more of a byproduct of history and reality more than intention.
Didn't I read, and I'm getting confused as to which chapter it was, but that because Rabbi Sacks suggested that perhaps it was the intention of God to have the Israelites in the wilderness so that they would know what it was like.
We'll talk about that next week when we get to Mishpatim.
Okay.
What I appreciated about it.
You guys seem to be proving your point from earlier.
Sorry.
I got the message. I heard you.
I think Rabbi Sacks I hadn't thought about the distinction he makes between a social contract and a covenant. And I think it's true, and I think it's very interesting. But the hard part, saying that a social contract is something between me and you, whereas covenant is us and what's good for us, and not a negotiation between me and you. But then the question arises, who is part of that covenant? So I guess it's easy to say your family first. You're all on the same side. But But how broad do you make it? So all the Jewish people, you know, where do you stop being part of an us and become we they?
That's an interesting question, which he doesn't actually address.
Right.
Is, you know, he talks a lot about the social contract and how, you know, nations need a social contract. But to create a viable society, we need a social covenant. But you're right. What he doesn't say is who's in and out of that covenant. Who do we allow into that covenant, and who do we exclude under it? And it's an interesting question. From a Jewish perspective, I think, you know, I think of it largely, anyone who wants to be part of the covenant can be part of the covenant, but then you need to be part of the covenant, right? Like, you can't say this part doesn't apply to me, or I don't want to do that.
But in Judaism, we do. There's no one thing that you have to do to be a Jew.
No, there's lots of things you have to do to be a Jew.
Things you should do, but
Well, so I mean, that's part of the challenge, I think, for modern Americans, is exactly what you said. It's things we should do. You know, modern American Jews don't like this language of obligation and covenant and things like that, especially liberal American Jews, who feel that this idea of covenant is exclusionary and non-inclusive. But if you look at the rabbinic text, it's pretty clear, like, the language of obligation comes up frequently in there. I think one of the problems is it's not enforceable. I don't come to services, I don't come to Minyan, you know, 3 times a day. What are you going to do about it? Right?
Well,
We can't do anything about it. Are good?
I don't,
Barbara had her hand up first. Let Barbara.
Oh, I thought you had your hand up first, so that's why I called on you first.
Because I'm been lazy and taking mine down. I don't get called that. It's interesting to me, exactly the us issue here. He says it's self-identification. He goes back to his old shtick of identification. And therefore, you're part of the covenant if you want to be part of the covenant. And you're right that if you don't do things, that doesn't, or if you don't follow certain rules, I don't know if it's a law that you should show up 3 times a day for Minyan, but if you don't do it, it's how you see it as far as whether you're, and that's why we can successfully have different types of Jews, because we're following a self-selected group of obligations. So that's why I'm conservative. That's why I'm not reform, because there are things that I do that aren't whatever the official word is, rules or regulations. And
So, you know,
exactly.
I want to be careful how we define denominationalism quickly.
Well, it's just sect, which is
I was like,
probably
no, because, you know, I think there is this notion, and I had this conversation with somebody else recently that said, you know, they were explaining Judaism to some non-Jews, saying, you know, Orthodox Jews are observant, conservative Jews are sort of observant, Reformed Jews are not observant. And I said, like, that's not the way we should be defining it. I like the difference is we have different interpretations of what it means to be observant.
Well,
That's the difference between the denominations.
I said form, not, because I think there's a lot of issue with Orthodox. And if what I could say about Orthodox is, I'm not Orthodox because I want to sit with the men in my faith. No. It's got nothing to do with what I, with anything except, I want to sit with my faith. So, but I did pick on Reform just because I was trying to grab one that isn't usually part.
I just want to make sure we're clear on the distinction there for one, and for two, just to respond quickly, and then we'll come to Stuart. Here's kind of the challenge I'll pose, and I'm not saying I believe this. I'm just saying let's look at it from an Orthodox perspective. If it is prohibited for you to sit with your male family, you are choosing to not follow certain parts of the covenant by choosing to sit with them. Right?
No.
If you look at it from like a strict perspective, like I'm not saying I agree with this, but for conservative Jews, we say that conservative Jews say that halacha, that prohibition, should no longer be in effect for all sorts of cultural, societal reasons. So it's fine. But
Stop you 1 second. Who made that, and at what? In other words, that doesn't go back to the Torah, does it? It's rabbinical, or it comes later. So I can be part of that covenant without.
I'd have to go back and look at how they derive the prohibition from hearing a woman singing, which is really what the bigger issue is with sitting with your family, and whether or not they derive it from the Torah or not. But, potato, it's still a prohibition. Right? In Orthodox eyes. And I'm not criticizing anybody.
No,
I'm not
no,
criticizing you.
I'm
I'm just trying to put the counter argument out there. Stuart, you had your hand up for a minute.
Margaret was first.
Oh,
Margaret.
Stuart, I'll let you guys decide.
What I wanted to say was that I don't know how we got onto this halakha thing, because if you read what Rabbi Sacks is talking about, and which is more, I don't know, seems more salient to me, what he's talking about is the way in which we interact with each other, that the social contract is kind of a transactional agreement, and that the covenant is an agreement to act for the group, and is not transactional in that sense. So I'm a little confused about how
I think where we got into it from was the question of who's in the covenant. And part of being in on the Jewish covenant is the halakha and the ritual. Now, I find an interesting comment in Sacks's book where he says, covenants create unity without uniformity. They value diversity, but rather than allowing a group to split into competing factions, they ask each to contribute something uniquely theirs to the common good. Beautiful sentence, beautiful sentiment, and it's exactly what hasn't happened in Judaism. Right? We've said, we're part of the covenant and you're not.
Not in a crisis.
Not in crisis mode, but
Or less so in crisis, yeah.
Yes, less so in crisis, but nonetheless, like we've used the covenant as a way to exclude people and to push people out, and to not keep people together without any side claiming victory or defeat, as he says on 89.
So, Rabbi Excuse
Well,
me.
I think Stuart had one, and then we'll come to you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, maybe we can talk just a little bit about circumcision. Because I mean, circumcision is considered part of a covenant between God and the Jewish people. But of course, only males get circumcised. So then you say, well, is that excluding women? Oh, no, it's symbolic. It's symbolic of our relationship with God. But there's something that bothers me about that. I mean, I'm very pro women, and not that I want women to get circumcised, but with this covenant is sort of fundamentally exclusionary, but you can rationalize it. So tell me about, and can you be Jewish? There's all these commandments we're supposed to do, and who knows if we really do them and we don't do them all. But if you're not circumcised, if you're a male and you're not circumcised, can you be Jewish?
So those are two separate questions. So to address the first question, yes, and that's why over the last 50, 60 years or so, might even be longer, these ideas of Simchat Bat or Brit Bat or some kind of welcoming ceremony for a daughter that is born have developed, because there was this feeling and this urge and this necessity to address the exact question that you're asking. Is like, we do something for our sons. Why don't we do something to welcome our daughters as members of the covenant as well? So that's exactly why we've developed the rituals that have developed. And there's dozens, if not hundreds of them that have developed in different ways of welcoming girls and daughters into the covenant as babies. To address the second question, yes, if you are a male and have not had your circumcision, assuming you are born of a Jewish woman, who was either Jewish by birth or conversion, but her son is not circumcised, he is still completely halachically Jewish. He just has not fulfilled the mitzvah of circumcision.
And lots of people that are not Jewish are circumcised.
Yes. But not for the sake of entering them into the covenant.
Right.
Which is the essential part of the circumcision ceremony.
But if you're an adult, I mean, in our family, for instance, we had one of my sisters married some guy who was not Jewish, and then he decided to convert, I mean, as a fully adult male, and he had not been circumcised. But he got circumcised. Because, I mean, if in that setting, I think you would think that's probably an important thing.
Yeah, so I mean, I had this conversation with Rabbi Dorf years ago, because there was a couple who came to me who said, the woman was Jewish, the husband was adopted by a Christian family and was not circumcised and all this, but found out as an adult that he was adopted and was born of a Jewish mother. And so I had said, he was trying to reclaim some of his Judaism, but was a little hesitant on the whole circumcision thing. And so I asked Rabbi Dorf his opinion. He said, I made this mistake once where I said, if you're not circumcised, you're not part of the Jewish people, in which I was corrected and given the appropriate text that said, actually, you're a full member of the Jewish community, you just have not fulfilled the mitzvah. So you're fine.
There's a big difference between covenant and mitzvah.
A mitzvah is a term of the covenant.
Yeah, but they're not, you can have them. All right. Let me think on that a little bit.
Yeah. So thinking about it large scale, a covenant is a long-term mutual agreement. So, I usually turn to the example of marriage. Part of the mitzvot of marriage, so to speak, is that you will only have one loving partner. You are faithful to your spouse, and that is one of the mitzvot of the covenant of marriage. Are there other ones? Of course, but that is, and some, different marriages have different mitzvot associated with them. So, but that's kind of the way I would think of it, is that the mitzvah is one of the terms of the covenant. TK?
What I find fascinating about this is reflected in the whole covenant, if you will, of Judaism, and I kind of parallel, say, the Constitution of the United States, for example, because the Constitution is something that's written, and yet it is endlessly interpreted, and in this. But the covenant is that we'll follow it, but it's complicated. The supposedly supreme interpretation is the Supreme Court of the United States, and they've reversed themselves recently, and in the past they've reversed themselves. They reversed themselves on the issue of slavery, for example, and yet the covenant endures, but it modifies and flows. And that's one of the things I really love about Judaism is that there's been so much thought and interpretation to everything, but it's still flexible somehow, even though God supposedly gave the commandments directly to Moses, and there it is, and it's literally written in stone. It's not. It's interpretable.
Yes.
Anyway.
Again, Rabbi Elliot Dorff, thank God it's a good day when you can talk about Rabbi Dorff. He's a good person. One of the sweetest, nicest people you will ever meet in your life. He has more than one book that kind of addresses this question. I believe the main one is For the Love of God and People, in which he makes a direct parallel between how Jews read the Torah and how Americans read the Constitution, and says there are distinctions and there are differences between them, but there are some pretty close similarities along the way, in that both are documents that are used well beyond the lifespan of those who wrote it, but are used to interpret and understand daily life that is drastically different than the circumstances in which it was written. And Judaism reverses itself also, or at least, I will broadly say conservative Judaism, Reform Judaism definitely reverse course. Orthodox Judaism does too. They just don't want to admit it. But there are probably 2,000 years worth of halakha saying that, go back to the example Barbara gave, that you should not hear a woman singing, and so men and women should sit separately in synagogue. Well, great, except we've reversed course and said there's nothing wrong with us doing that. And the way Rabbi Dorff often looks at it is, he looks at halakha and Jewish law as an organism. And just as an organism changes and grows and evolves, and sheds dead cells that no longer serve it, so too the body of law grows and changes and evolves and sheds dead laws that no longer serve it.
But how do you reconcile that if you believe in the literal, that God gave this word to the people?
Well, that's why I'm not an Orthodox rabbi.
So perhaps one could say that that's what the people of Israel needed at that time in order to start their journey. Would that
That's
be
certainly
fair?
one argument. Maimonides makes a somewhat similar argument in terms of the sacrificial system, as he says something along that line of God doesn't want animal sacrifices, but knew if God had commanded anything but animal sacrifices to our ancestors, they would have been completely confused and baffled because they lived in a society where everybody else was sacrificing animals to gods, and they would not have known they wouldn't have been able to comprehend what God actually wanted in that time. We have grown and evolved to a point where we can say that's not what God wants. God wants prayer. God wants our hearts. And so we don't need the animal sacrifices anymore. So, I mean, that is a potential argument to make, but then you also have to then understand, you have to then discern which parts of it are eternal and which parts of it are not, which is a more challenging enterprise. Yes,
That's
Bart.
our job.
I'd like to ask about something that bothered me here. Yes, he talks about the value of covenant and making a covenant. And he uses the examples early on when he's talking about the Anglican bishops and he's talking about American presidential politics or American politics. And he tells both groups that they need a covenant. He doesn't give an instruction as, okay, how do you get a covenant? And if you think about other covenants in our world, the covenants that say you can't have a fence in my neighborhood, every single house except for ours has a fence. Well, maybe not every, but there are fences all over the place. And I think if you look up covenant, another thing that I'm familiar with, covenants in legal transactions, as far as, I don't know, mortgages, etc. How do you make a covenant? How can he say at the end, if you have a situation where there's conflict, frame a covenant to get those people together? Okay, I love what he says about a covenant being compared to the Havdalah candle. 3 strands, 1 flame. Sounds great. But please, Rabbi Sacks, teach me how to do it. Or Rabbi Henkin, since you're the one here and he's not.
So I'll say 2 things to it. The first is it's really hard.
Okay, I figured that.
The second thing is, again, think of it kind of as in terms of marriage. What are the mitzvot? What are the covenants? What are the terms of the covenant of your relationship with your spouse? What are the things that you expect of them and only them? And what are the things they expect of you and only you?
That he does the dishes and I put dinner on the table.
That's a viable term of the covenant,
Sounds more like
one
a
cooks, the
contract
other's
to me.
cooking. But it doesn't necessarily happen organically. Sometimes you have to sit down and hammer out some of those issues. Who's going to be in charge of the dishes? Who's going to be in charge of the cooking? Who's going to be in charge of the laundry? Who's going to be in charge of the cleaning? Who's going to do what parts of the cleaning? Who's going to plan date nights? Who's going to supply the finances? Who's going to do, there's things that get negotiated, sometimes over time in a relationship, sometimes before the marriage. Are you going to have children? What do you expect of the children? Who's going to be responsible for what parts of raising the children? So some of it is in terms of the parties who are involved need to talk out and negotiate what that covenant is going to look like between two parties. And understand that over time, those things might change. Covenants evolve over time, and ideally, in a successful covenant, they evolve with open communication and cooperation between the partners of the covenant.
That's a problem. How do we get open communication, switching from my marriage, we just don't talk, it's not. If we go to American politics, which is
So-
where Rabbi Sacks started. So,
Yeah. So, actually, Rabbi Sacks, I think, mostly goes there with, would say that's more of a social contract. But I think I agree with most of you that I think we are bound by an American covenant living in America. There is a covenant that is involved in it, and we
Sorry.
we are members of it. Voting is one way that we are part of the covenant. We vote for those people who best represent our vision and our ideals for what it means to be part of the American covenant. Writing, talking to our Congress people or elected officials more broadly, I should say, because it affects, city as well as country. We talk to them, we have communication with them. We let them know what we think, what we believe, what we feel, and where they are succeeding or not succeeding in, identifying what it means to us as living in terms of that covenant. I do think that's part of the problem we have in American politics is I think people aren't necessarily convinced that those elected officials are actually paying attention to them. Which is where we're running into problems overall as in a large scale with it. But I think from a civics point of view, that's how you would help with the American covenant, is you would say you would vote for the people that that best represent your vision for that covenant.
But I don't know that all Americans look at it as a covenant and not a social contract. They're more interested in what's best for me and what do I get out of it, and don't look at the total picture. What's the right thing or what's best for the United States?
Yeah.
So
I'm not sure they do. I think they look at it as what's best, what am I getting out of this? And that's a challenge. It's a challenge of, how do we reshape the politics in our country to take less of the view of what's in it for me and what's the social contract and more of the what is the covenant, what are my obligations and responsibilities as an American, and how can we all as Americans live up to that covenant. I don't have answers to the question, by the way. I'm just putting that out there. I'm not a politician.
Dad, you're young enough
just
to run. You're young enough to run for president. If you had the
if you're looking at the current candidates for president, nobody in this room is too old to be running for president.
Yep. What's always been difficult for me is the very low turnout in an election, which is the foundation of our covenant.
Yeah.
And I think you know, you look at countries that have newly won the right to vote, and they, you know, they have, everybody gets out no matter what. And I think we've just become so complacent about it, and maybe pessimistic about it. I don't know what the problem is, but perhaps we need, you know, a new way to vote. Perhaps
Maybe. I
don't
would I
know.
would question whether it's complacent or disillusioned,
I think both.
potentially.
Yeah.
People don't even vote their own self-interest. I mean, they don't.
Yeah.
And that doesn't make any sense to me, but that's
Well,
Well, that's
I
just
think
like,
my vote doesn't count. I mean, that's
it.
yeah, well, that's just like with the, I guess there was like something about people being drafted in the UK that trickled down to, us, the US also drafting people, like the draft going into effect. And just watching the TikToks alone on that is almost like they didn't understand the consequences if there was a draft and they didn't go. I mean, I'm not a history person, but it's my understanding that if you don't go, like your only options are like to leave the country or go to jail if you are drafted and you just like, I'm not gonna go. I don't think 90% of the people even understand there's a consequence of if I don't, this is what happens. I think they think it's optional. I mean, it is optional, but if you choose not to, you know, this is what happens. I think a lot of them think it's like, well, if I don't want to go, you can't make me. And I think that's just one thing that's an example of just like they just unaware, just basic, you know, if I went to history class, I might know this, you know. I don't think if I watched a movie about certain time periods, I should be aware of what happens if someone is drafted and they don't go. I think that's one example of just how some generations, mine included, just are just unaware of, you know, the realities of things. It's not always about what you want, you know. So
Yes,
There
Barbara?
I
really
was
is-
interested to, go, I'm sorry, Barbara, go ahead.
Well, I actually cut the rabbi off too. Cherie, I'm very interested here because I think you're saying two things. They're not thinking about me, what happens to me if I refuse. They're also not thinking about what happens to us if I refuse.
well, I think they are thinking about me, but they think in the sense that of what I want if
Right.
I don't do this. They're not
But they're
thinking that
thinking-
there's already laid out consequences of your choice.
They're
If you
thinking about me without complete information. They're thinking
Right.
about me from a point of ignorance. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it still comes down to the greater good, right?
Right.
Because is there value to a draft?
Right.
That's
Sorry.
very,
Forget.
Two things in the discussion about voting. I think we kind of left out the part about the certain groups trying to interfere with or prevent people from voting as one of the problems with the low turnout.
I want to come back to that in a minute, but go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead with that.
No, finish what you were saying, because I was going to take into a kind of a broader scope, but
The other thing was that I read an article, a kind of heartening article recently in one of the newspapers that talked about the service academies and how they have amped up, I guess, particularly in view of the participation of service people in the insurrection, about how they have amped up their teaching about civics and about the Constitution, and about what exactly they're about the oaths that they are taking, and teaching about what it means to take those the oaths that they take upon graduation.
So I'm
That's
glad I
good
let
to
you
hear.
finish, because I think that segues into, I think, what I wanted to circle back to is one, Suzanne's question at the beginning is who's part of the covenant? But also, I think what we see somewhat is, I think different people have a different concept of what the covenant actually is and what the covenant should be. And that's where I think we're running into some larger issues in our politics, is disputing interpretations, not unlike Judaism in this case, of what does it actually mean to be part of the covenant. Now, some of it is, as Margaret was saying, they're doing. I think we do need better civics education, so that people understand how things work and understand what their obligations and responsibilities as citizens are, because they don't know that. We can't expect them to be good citizens if they don't know what that means. But who is part of the covenant and who is not part of the covenant, both in Judaism and in American culture.
Well, supposedly everybody in America, if you're an American citizen, you're supposed to be part of the covenant.
Okay, and what if you want to become an American citizen?
Then there's a way to become one, just like you can become Jewish.
And what if there's, say, 100,000 people who all want to become American citizens at once?
We need more classes. I'm
just putting it out there because I think that's some of what we're seeing is there are people who want to come here and want to be a part of America, but the question is, how do we get them ready to all be American? How do we train them into what it means? And how are we going to make sure that they are successful Americans without just, throwing them into the deep end and hoping that they can swim?
Well, just like becoming Jewish, there's classes to be taken in a test, right?
Yes.
Take a test to become an American.
Yes. And, can we accommodate everybody who wants to be in?
With the technology the way it is, they should be able to take the classes through an app.
If they have an app. But yes.
Yeah.
Look, this gets complicated.
Yeah,
This gets complicated in, practice more than in theory.
but there is a way, and not everybody is going to make it through, but everybody should be given a chance. Just the same with Judaism. Not everybody is going to, at the end of our class, everybody is not going to feel as though they're ready. In our one-on-one class, they're not going to feel as though they're ready, but the class is open and available if you want to take it.
Yes.
So,
And particularly your class, there are a lot of people who started off in the class who decided I'm not doing it,
yes,
which is fine.
and they know a lot more than I do before class started, and probably even so now. But again, like you said, it just doesn't work out for everyone. So, yeah.
So, look, I think what you also have is also, like Judaism, you have some people who think anybody should be able and willing to be able to become a American citizen. Just like we have some people who think anybody can and should be able to become Jewish. And then we have people who are a little more hesitant to let anybody in unless they can demonstrate their faithfulness to the covenant, whatever covenant it might be. Which is again a question of what does it mean to be part of the covenant? And what is our vision for the future of this country, which is, and the future of Judaism for that matter, which is a difficult question to answer. Not sure how much we actually got into Rabbi Sacks's commentary, by the way, but that's okay too.
I think we stayed pretty on track this time. Covenant, contract,
That's what the idea. We just
I think that's exactly, I really like his last sentence. Things we can do together that none of us can do alone, which is why we have this class. We are exposed to so much more together than I would be here with just the book and me. Thank you.
And that's a hopeful note to end on, that as a Jewish people, as an American people, we can do more together than any of us can do alone. And the more we have as part of that covenant, and the more we have supporting that covenant, the more we can do together as well. God willing. All right, next week for those who read it this week, go ahead and reread Mishpatim just to kind of refresh your memory, and we'll cover it next week, and we'll keep learning from there.
Are you with us next week?
No, I will not be here next week. Barbara has generously offered to teach and to lead the discussion, but if somebody else would like to step up and do it next week, it's a good chapter. I like that chapter, actually. That was a good one. If someone else would like to step up instead, please let us know.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Barbara. And Stuart disappeared before I could twist his arm, since he has so many questions about that chapter. I guess I'll bring him up.
Well, I say if you want to email Barbara and Stuart and see if one of them, that's fine, and just make sure everybody knows who's doing what. So.
Thank you, Barbara.
You're not going to ask Stuart and let me off the hook?
No.
How about if everybody votes against me and in favor of Stuart?
Take care, everybody. Have a good week, and we'll see you. I'll see you in 2 weeks, and we'll get back into groove then. But be well.
Thank you.